Many UFO sightings are limited to one or perhaps a few individual witnesses. While their stories may be compelling, they often lack additional reports or encounters to correlate what they've seen. This, however, is not always the case. Two historical sightings with strikingly similar visual profiles present cases where craft were not only seen by multiple witnesses, but were extremely well documented. My name is Aaron Deese, and joining me once again on UFOs Revisited are Ron Murphy, Heather Mosier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Mark Matsky. This is the Lights of Phoenix and Lubbock. So we are talking about two cases today, and we'll discuss some of the ways in which they may overlap, but let's break down the events in question first. What do we know about, it's a kind of an obscure case, maybe you haven't heard of it. What do we know about the Phoenix Lights incident?
I love digging into these stories that nobody's ever heard of before.
Yeah, it's very obscure in this community.
Phoenix Lights, of course, kind of remain a cornerstone in the modern discussion about UFOs. March 13th, 1997, between 7:30 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., there are actually two series of incidents. The first involving what most observers described as being a very large V-shaped arrangement of lights. Tim Lay and his wife Bobby, one of the first couple of observers, said that they remembered it almost looking kind of like it was circular shaped, like an arc. On the exterior of like a balloon. But as it got closer, they realized that it was a distinct leading edge in a V shape, as some commentators have described it, an A without the lower bar. And as it's moving along, they observed this. It was kind of difficult to determine whether it was an object that was pretty widely spaced and higher up, or if it was lower and the light orientation was closer together. There wasn't any sound associated with this. But, I mean, there were many observers that night. I mean, at least several hundreds, probably more than that. And as this event occurs, possibly observers in multiple states outside of just the general Phoenix area, although that's the name that was ascribed to it, there were a lot of sightings of these objects, these lights, whether they were one single object or several. But most descriptions describe 5 of these lights flying in formation. Then later that night, there's also a secondary incident where there are several lights that appear, and they are kind of stationary. And these were observed by a few people. In both instances, I believe there were films actually made of these occurrences, and so it really became a big story. Also worthy of mentioning is the fact that in addition to people saying they saw this and people grabbing their video cameras and filming these lights, we had a lot of calls that were sent to the National UFO Reporting Center. Peter Davenport diligently managing the phone lines that evening. And if memory serves, I think that live on the air on Coast to Coast AM, Art Bell is doing his program, and he's got Peter Davenport coming on the show and giving live updates, as Art himself said he was receiving calls from people in the Phoenix area saying, we've got something going on down here in our skies. We're seeing something, and it's big. A lot of people, some famous individuals also observe these lights, but I mean, I think that really the attention that it got, and also the fact that UFO researchers were documenting it almost in real time, that made it a landmark case.
So one of the first people to report this to an air traffic controller was Kurt Russell. And I think that any good UFO story has to have Kurt Russell in it, right? And because he's known for science fiction and everything like that, so he kind of has this tie in there. But he is one of the first people to report seeing the lights, and I think that just adds such a, not so much authenticity, but isn't that what you would expect out of a culture like America, to have a movie star report these lights being seen? That's just so American.
And the funny thing is, he wasn't aware until years later that he had been this primary witness. Yeah. He saw this. He was a civilian pilot, and I think he was flying his son, who was dating a girl who was living around the Phoenix area at that time, and he flies his son in to see his girlfriend, and he sees the lights, and he reports it to air traffic controllers. We've got some sort of lights out here. You guys see that? Now, my understanding had been that Phoenix Sky Harbor air traffic controllers did not detect anything on radar. But years later, there was a television documentary about this, and they mention a civilian pilot even reported to air traffic controllers as he was on approach to Phoenix Sky Harbor that he observed these lights. And Kurt Russell's sitting there watching it and says, wait a minute, that's me.
Well, this case generated so much buzz so very quickly that the governor of Arizona basically had to respond. And so they held a press conference wherein the governor came out and said, "We have apprehended the individual responsible for this event." And a member of his staff was brought out wearing an alien costume. And he kind of finished the press conference by saying, "Some of you have been watching too many movies," or something to that effect. But then this gentleman gives an interview in 2007, 10 years later, and says, quote, "I'm a pilot and I know just about every machine that flies. It was bigger than anything that I've ever seen. It remains a great mystery. Other people saw it, responsible people. I don't know why people would ridicule it." That's very interesting. What do you guys make of that?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that Symington had to make a mockery, and I know it made a lot of these witnesses in the Phoenix area really upset. I mean, it's propagating the tinfoil hat narrative, and this is a big joke, and people were really angry. They saw something and they wanted answers. So, and Dr. Lynn Kitai has really taken this and has just been, not only keeping the investigation going and it alive in the public eye, but she's actually taken these witnesses and she's doing currently a study on how seeing these lights has affected them psychologically. And I think that's a fascinating project that she's taken on. So a lot of credit goes to Dr. Lynn Kitai for the work she's done.
Talking with her, she's also seen these lights herself and in
Yes.
other instances in the area apart from the main witness, the primary events of that evening too.
Right. I believe she actually filmed from her deck some of these orange orbs, now different from that evening, but other anomalous activity. And in fact, I believe the Phoenix light was also seen in Tucson and even into Nevada on that same day, March 13th, 1997. So it was traveling through Nevada into the Tucson, Arizona, Phoenix area. So multiple witnesses in different states. And that's fascinating as well.
Well, Fife Symington has this interesting arc that you point out, where he does this press conference soon after the events, trying to make light, sort of break the tension of it. And later that year, he finds himself embroiled in a bank fraud court case. And because of that, he resigns his position as governor in disgrace, essentially, and then is forced to sort of reinvent himself his whole life, going back to sort of his basics. He came from old money, real estate developer, a really interesting guy, but a lifelong politician as well. And though he's not really gotten back into public office at this point, he does make that transition from someone who trotted out a guy in an alien mask to someone who in that interview just straight up says, "I think this was from another place," whatever people saw. And you can sort of see, putting him, not just flipping from the switch from, doubt to belief, but he goes through this whole personal, embroiled situation where his whole life is thrown into ruin, essentially. He's made a public laughingstock of, and people think of him now, he gave an interview fairly recently in the paper because there's all these anniversaries coming up of Phoenix Lights and things. And people ask him, how are you remembered versus how do you want to be remembered? And he wants to be remembered as someone who governed well, a good father, a good grandfather, etc. But he says, chances are I'll be remembered as the Phoenix Lights governor. And he's kind of uneasy with that, but at the same time, he recognizes now something legitimately happened that's inexplicable in the skies over Phoenix that night. But just through a series of events, his governorship was characterized by a couple kinds of scandal. And it's just a kind of an all-American story in that regard. He's trying to find some sort of redemption here at the end, at least by saying, yeah, I did see them. I made it a point to go out and see them. And this was brought out earlier on by this idea that this was such a span of time during which this was happening. You could call your friends and say, hey, go out on your back deck and see if you're seeing what I'm seeing, and to call into Coast to Coast and things like that. And Symington was in that number. He said, I kind of broke the rules and drove out myself, because he was, had a detail. He wasn't supposed to just drive places as the governor and be by himself, but he did in order to see the lights. He said, I saw them, yeah, I'm a pilot. It's exactly the quote that you pulled. And I just find that very interesting, the reactions of people. We'll talk about her later, but Francis Barwood is another politician, a local politician in this case, who was forced to now deal with what had happened and what people were saying versus then the response that was coming back, which in many cases was a wall of silence.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when we talk about these cases, there's a significant impact on the witnesses, but this one has such far-reaching consequences. Very often we're talking about, again, one or two individuals who share their story and they may be haunted by it, but as Mark just illustrated, this had political implications for people because it was so widespread. Micah mentioned other states a few minutes ago, and this is not the only case where a large V-like formation of lights was seen over a populated area. A similar craft or series of craft, of course we don't know exactly what they are, would appear in Lubbock, Texas in August and September of 1951. This case was actually investigated by Project Blue Book, and the officer in charge was quoted as saying, "Officially all of the sightings except the UFO that was picked up on radar are unknowns." Now, I'm not sure what "except the UFO that was picked up on radar" means. I don't know exactly what incident that one is referring to, but there were multiple sightings over a series of days of the so-called Lubbock Lights, as they've been called. The first one took place at approximately 9 p.m. by 3 professors of the nearby Texas Technical College, which is now known as Texas Tech University. They were gathered at some kind of a social event in the evening. Not a whole lot of light pollution in Lubbock at that point in time, still significantly less there now than in other parts of the state. And they saw this formation of lights moving over them. But then on August 30th, a student at Texas Technical College, the same university that these professors worked at, would witness the lights, and this was also reported to the nearby authorities. There is an active airfield near Lubbock, and it was in operation at this point in time, and we'll get to that. Micah has some interesting details on that as well. But it was also investigated by local game wardens. Birds were ruled out as the source. They said there's no way these are birds. Birds don't do this. They don't look like that. They don't light up at night like this. And this sighting took place obviously well before the era of publicly available drones. If this were to happen today, it could be some drones. Okay, maybe not the same with the Phoenix Lights because it was described as being so big. But this is 1951. This is very shortly after the end of World War II. Aviation as we know it today was in its very early days. The space race was, not really a thing at that point in time. And here comes over rural Texas, very rural Texas, this giant formation of lights. And I wanted to add this case to our discussion today for 2 reasons. One, it has these visual similarities to the Phoenix Lights that I find very interesting. And 2, I don't feel it gets a whole lot of attention in UFO discussions. I have actually some family in Lubbock, and I asked them during research, is this something that's ever talked about? Do you guys know about this? And even out in Lubbock, people aren't really discussing it. Now, granted, common topics of conversation for us may differ a little bit from some other people, so bear that in mind. Yeah. But all that being said, what do we know about the Lubbock Lights? What do you guys have on this?
So I know that the photographer was, like you said, a student. His name was Carl Hart Jr., and he took a picture. It has been scrutinized and just ripped apart, but determined that there was nothing fake about it, that he hadn't messed with the negatives or anything of that nature. He's an older gentleman now, obviously, but has been interrogated, he said, intensely by the Air Force and the FBI. He said until the point that they must have given up. But he was questioned, I guess, by the MIBs, except they had official designations behind them. But he has stated before that he would, this is not necessarily the way that he would have liked his life to have gone because of the scrutiny that came along with it. But he was just a student, just out taking pictures, and it was a similar situation like with Phoenix where there was enough time to go out, take the picture. He took multiple photos. He said there were 2 flights that came over of the two, or of like 4 or 5 photos that he took. There were 2 flights that he took pictures of. So he had plenty of time to do that as well.
Interesting.
And there are kind of the second generation of UFO books that came out, and even like down to the level of scholastic books, Lubbock Lights were a big part of those. I think in large part because there was photographic evidence that they could put with the article about Lubbock. So for a time, that was a rather famous case, and I think it just sort of passed out of consciousness then for a while. But this is, the parallels with Phoenix is a good reason to bring it back to light.
When they said the objects in the photos were brighter than stars, and by examining the photos in their succession, they can tell that the objects changed position. So it wasn't presumably just a stationary or a craft with just stationary lights. The lights themselves change position across the photos.
I find those photos really interesting personally. And again, to my knowledge, there was never any official explanation or alternative. I mean, it seems to be something legitimately photographed that also matched the description given by several professors with the Texas Technological College there near Lubbock, who had all observed this. You know, they described them as kind of bluish green, very faint. But again, if they were individual lights, they were flying in formation, and they moved silently, very quickly overhead. Now, as you mentioned, Aaron, Project Blue Book did investigate this, and its first director, Edward Ruppelt, had led that investigation. And he rather cryptically said in his book, and this is a landmark in the history of the subject, the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, he said at the end of the chapter, the Lubbock Lights Unabridged, that he had been given an explanation that just for him it just clinched the whole thing, and he didn't really say what it was. It was really strange. He said, I'm not in a position to say what this actually was. I later read someplace that I think that one of the explanations a scientist had given him had been that maybe it had been moths flying. It doesn't sound like what's in that photograph, or look like it to me, and I've always found that somewhat dubious personally. But now what's also interesting about this case, and even if Ruppelt had somehow become convinced that he had a good explanation for the primary sighting, is that right around the same time, there were a couple of other very interesting cases, one which might explain that radar detection that you're discussing right there. Prior to the immediate Lubbock sighting, there had been a man who had actually worked with Sandia Labs and held a secret clearance, and his wife, who observed this silent moving, kind of a swept wing aircraft fly overhead. It had these dark stripes on the wings running backward. And they provided a very credible description of this. Now, by today's standards, I hear that description and I think, oh, kind of like maybe a B-2 Spirit, you know, the stealth bomber. But not in 1951. We didn't have that back then, and if we did, there's a whole other chapter of aviation history we haven't opened yet. So I always found that to be good, and I think even Ruppelt described that immediately preceding the primary Lubbock Lights case as being a good UFO case. Then we had, just immediately afterward, the following morning, a detection on radar from two different stations of an object moving northwest. I think it was tracked all the way up to like Washington. It had been moving 900 miles per hour. And this was not unveiled at the time that Ruppelt wrote his book, but sometime later. One of those ground-based radar stations, they actually tried to scramble a fighter aircraft to go and intercept this thing, but it was moving quickly and it was out of the way by the time they get up there. But one of the ground-based radar stations pinged this with IFF, identification friend or foe. And the object responds in the affirmative, friendly. And what that means, of course, is that, you know, we use identification friend or foe so that we can have a transponder system that helps us identify aircraft that might be ours if we can't see them. They didn't see this thing, but it reportedly responds in the affirmative. And furthermore, they said that it was an APX-6 IFF unit that in likelihood would have been used, and that unit was classified at that time. Now, I found this really interesting because, to me, that seems to suggest that there was a really fast-moving aircraft the day after the Lubbock Lights case that was observed from two ground-based stations with an identifiable IFF unit that was classified at that time. Sounds like a stealth craft or some kind of a secret project to me, which has never been revealed publicly, okay? So I find that case to be interesting, but now we should make a distinction. I don't know that what was seen in Lubbock by those professors and then what was detected the following morning, I have no way of knowing if those are the same craft.
Yeah.
But Ruppelt said there were this nexus of several reports around that time that were all very intriguing, and in the broader context, that really makes this an interesting case.
Right. And I think the distinction might be that in the 51 case of the Lubbock Lights, it's something we're seeing now, and we're getting reports in currently of these moving lights, that they weren't all stationary and a solid object that perhaps we might have. That suggests to me that it might be something otherworldly that at that time in 1951 that can move like that. I think that's really interesting and compelling.
So why would an alien spacecraft utilize lights?
Good question.
That's a good question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if we are conspiracy theorists, we go back to the whole Eisenhower thing and say that that was an agreement that they would somehow identify themselves through a certain use of lights so they wouldn't be shot down. I mean, and that's a plausibility, I suppose. But that's always one of those questions: is why would a foreign power use lights as identification?
Yeah, it's almost as if they're giving us little tidbits, like
Tidbits,
they want
that's
us
right,
to
that's
kind
right.
of just see them out of our peripheral and then have this
Yeah.
discussion. So this, we are slowly as a species, we understand that there's something else out there, and that's how they're doing it.
Yeah, the lights become enlightening. But no, it's curious because this is one of those cases where it happened, right? Like there's no, the people saw lights in the sky, it's just what they happened to be. And I mean, they might have been wanting to see what would happen, what our response would be. And our response, I think, because I remember watching the press conference about the lights, because they were talking about possibly being military flares and such, and they were coming up with all these proposals. And I remember watching it on CNN whenever they brought out the little alien. I thought how degrading that was to people that were seriously interested in this, right? So the idea of misinformation, not only misinformation, but mocking people that thought that this might have been something otherworldly. At that point, I really had a bad taste in my mouth, because if this is what's going to go on, if anything unexplained happens, and if this is how they're going to greet the curious public, then what are we to believe?
Right. And that's still going on today. Like with Grush and Congress,
Sure.
we have this whistleblower protection, and now they basically drag them through the mud in an attempt so others won't come forward.
That's
so
right, that's
in
right.
some regard, that's still continuing to this day.
Yeah,
And it's
Grush.
really unfortunate.
Grush and others, a lot of the military pilots have
right.
talked about this stigma. And I think that really we could look at the press conference related to the Phoenix Lights and the way that they brought the alien out as being kind of a case study in the way that we perpetuate these stigmas. Now, in fairness, the Air Force initially, they didn't want to say very much, and that's a little strange, but I mean it's pretty common in these cases. And then they kind of begrudgingly come out a few days later and say, oh, we did have some A-10s that were flying in formation. Yep, that was us. And in fact, actually out there over the Berry Goldwater Range, we had some A-10 warthogs dropping flares. Very convenient sounding, huh? But there are, and I should point out fairly, there are some UFO researchers who also believe that and have followed that evidence. I mean, to give a couple of examples, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who is by no means a debunker, he triangulated the location of the objects out there that were seen during the 10 o'clock encounter, and he did seem to think that it was consistent with flares that would have been dropped. Thomas Bullard, who's a legendary folklorist and commentator on this, he took a sampling of, probably more than 120 of the primary observers from the case. And he said, in his opinion, based on what the descriptions of these objects were, that they were probably aircraft flying in formation rather than a single large object with a leading edge. And there was at least one amateur astronomer who, he had actually said he'd looked through his telescope and said, they look like aircraft to me. But coming back to Symington, we got to really emphasize this point too. I mean, whatever the lights were, they had a huge effect on people. And Symington, after making fun of it, comes out and he says, look, I did see this. It was kind of transformative for me too. And I have sympathy. He even, I think, apologized for kind of making a mockery of that.
Yeah.
If there is some sort of an effort, and I find it a little strange that there's going to be this obvious display if it's the Air Force flying, and I'm not disputing that it could have been aircraft, but if they're going to do that and fly so obviously out in the open for everyone to see them, they had to have known what kind of effect it's going to happen. So is there, if we were to follow that line of logic, could there be some reason why they would put on some sort of a display like this? I mean, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist either, but it seems to me that the effect would be obvious and they should have known that that's what would have happened. Was that in itself a way to try and perpetuate the stigma? I don't know.
Or perhaps that was the point. If this was something that was government orchestrated, perhaps you mentioned that this is a case study in how these stories perpetuate.
Yeah.
Perhaps the whole point was that this was a case study in how will people react if they think a giant spacecraft has appeared over a populated area. Because there are other cases we'll talk about where there have been mass UFO sightings over major cities. But the Phoenix Lights is interesting because it was so recent. We have so much documentation. There is very clear video that you can find online of this event. So yeah, as you said earlier, Ron, there's no really disputing that this event took place. And even though we have fewer witnesses in the Lubbock case, it's kind of the same thing. It's
very similar, yeah.
There's really not an argument as to whether or not either of these events actually transpired. And that's another parallel that I find so interesting.
And let's make the point too that if they were these aircraft in formation, they make noise. And it's going to
Should've,
be
yeah.
quite loud. You have 5 of these coming overhead. And if I saw something that spectacular, I don't know about you, but in 1997, I would have grabbed my camera and go, wow, you know.
Yeah.
But these were soundless. They made no noise. So
That's always seemed strange to me too. Yeah, no sounds. I don't know of any cases where the observers reported any sound associated with the objects. My understanding also is that they were not detected on radar. Observers of those lights that I personally have interviewed described that they just looked like lights flying overhead, but there'd been no sound, and they weren't really as shocked and amazed by it as some observers. You know, some people really thought this was incredible. Others just said, well, it was like lights. I think the broader point is a lot of people saw them, but it is strange that if these are fighter aircraft, that they didn't make noise, no sound was associated with them. When I see fighter jets flying over my home, they make a lot of noise. And yes, these objects weren't detected on radar either.
I have a question. Whenever this happened in March of 97, how long was it between when they were first seen and then Symington came out and had the mockery of a press conference?
That was pretty recently. I mean, maybe a couple of days.
It was just a couple days later? Okay. So he didn't waste any time.
Yeah. But then it was some time later that he comes out and says, look, folks, I've got to be honest, I saw this. And his exact words were there was a distinct leading edge. He described the same thing that others had seen that night.
right. I think that some credit. There was a woman. I don't know if she was a reporter or something, or in the political arena, but she wasn't going to let this go, and she really took the reins. So Mark, maybe you can talk about that. I think that's important.
Absolutely, yeah. Frances Barwood was her name. She was on the Phoenix City Council, one of 9 spots on the council, I think, and the only woman. And her constituents were calling her to tell her what they saw. And you're exactly right, Katie. She did not let it go. She just wanted to get answers for the people in her district. Honestly, I mean, in interviews, she just comes across as completely genuine and willing to speak her mind. And she's always been that way. And it's just the way it is. And she was immediately met with stonewalling. The rest of the council was like, we can't talk about that. And she was, well, why not? This is happening. So many people have seen this. Is that going to be our official response as nothing? And that's kind of what she faced, to the degree that it did cause her political trouble. And I think ultimately led to her not being reelected in her position. But she too would talk on record, spoke with Art Bell. He interviewed her, gave her an entire hour to really unspool her whole story. And she just said, look, my only interest in this is getting answers for the people who have seen these things and to legitimize this experience. It happened. Why are we pretending as a government like it didn't? And so you get into all of these moving parts of local government and then federal government interacting with local governments. To what degree do they enter each other's spheres of influence? You know, that is underneath all of these, especially the Phoenix Lights and Lubbock Lights too, to some degree, that there's these interactions going on. But and I guess that's where you can almost understand Dr. Kitai's work as an extension of Barwood's work, of just letting people relate their stories. You mentioned people had this kind of transformation effect of just seeing the lights. It did something to them, and I think that's something Dr. Kitai brings out in her work as well, is saying that for some people it was just, oh, there's lights in the sky, but for others it was like, it caused them to question like the direction of their lives in some cases. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And sent them on a different path. So that enlightenment, right? I mean, there was some type of enlightenment for some people, and that's part of these stories as well.
It's almost, in a way, what more does one need to have a serious conversation about aerial phenomena, especially at this point in time? You know, this is quite a bit before the era that we're in now, where the discourse has evolved quite a bit. More people are open to it than they were at that time. But what else do you really need, you know, aside from a dramatic landing wherein an extraterrestrial steps onto Earth and says, I do or don't come in peace, other than hundreds of people seeing a massive unidentified formation over a city, you know? So it is, in a way, it's frustrating when you look at the way this case was handled, because we kind of missed an opportunity as a society to have a serious conversation that in some ways is only just now getting going. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Well, bottom line, too, I mean, thousands of witnesses, you know, the government response, the high-profile nature of this and the publicity it received, it's, you know, kind of becoming a mainstay in ufological literature. Whether that's, you know, by intent or it's merely a good opportunity, I think that this is one of those landmark instances where you have a lot of opportunities for study. What are human, you know, reactions to aerial phenomena? What are government responses to claims that they are not being forthcoming with information? I mean, it in that case should be really, or in that context, it should be kind of a prime case study in a lot of these dynamics that we face in terms of trying to understand the human side and also transparency and other issues related to the study of UFOs.
Right, and I think it also opened up the conversation for what will our response be if an extraterrestrial presence does make contact with us. And I think there have been panels that have discussed this and want to look at this topic more seriously. And the Phoenix Lights was really a catalyst to really open that discussion up because of the amount of witnesses and that. So now we're faced with how would our response be? Are we going to meet them with, you know, weapons and that, or, you know, who's going to be our ambassador? Who is our ambassador? Who would we pick? I don't know.
Or are we all going to just kind of go, okay, well, I'm late for work.
Yeah.
I can tell you one thing, if Phoenix Lights happens again tomorrow night, there's going to be a lot more videos.
Oh, right. I'm hoping for a Phoenix Lights incident, you know, because it would, that's disclosure right there, because everybody has a phone in their hand now.
Right, that's really worth pointing out, because 97, we were still on the cusp of everybody having a high-quality video camera in your pocket. I mean, this was like the internet still in its infancy, really. Maybe you had a camcorder, or if you were really fancy, you had a direct-to mini compact disc recorder, but those were your options. So the footage that we have is limited way more than if it happened today, you know. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but I vividly remember an episode of Sightings that was the Phoenix Lights, and they kept showing that one clip of what appeared to be flares, either flares dropping or the craft sort of clearing the ridge of a hill. And I just watched that so excitedly because I had read about it and heard about it, but there was a gap of time before that type of video became available. And they were very quick to say, oh, it's flares. And I just felt so let down by that. Like, come on, are we watching the same thing? Because that just doesn't look like that to me. But we would have tons more things to look at today if it were to happen in 24.
And I wonder if the response would have been the same, though, too. You know, I don't know if they would walk a little alien out. I don't think they would do that now. I think that we're a little bit beyond that now. Yeah. Do we know, was it the next day the conference was held? Because Heather brought up a good point. I don't remember if it was a couple of days or if they had the press conference the very next day.
Right. I only know it was in the near term.
Right. Because this was March and they had an alien costume already ready.
That's a very interesting point.
If it was the next day, this is the day before Amazon, right? So and it happened at night. So that means they already had to have this planned.
Yeah. Or someone was roused from bed at 2 a.m. Right. Find an alien costume. Right. I don't care where you have to go. You have 48 hours.
And a 7-year-old.
One more parallel, maybe just kind of to help further contextualize these cases. I mean, because in the Phoenix Lights incident, whatever you believe these things may have been, they are described as a large triangular shape or a V shape. And this is a common trope in modern ufology. Both large V-shaped craft, sometimes distinctly trianguloid craft with a light at each of the three corners, sometimes a reddish light in the center. There are also these large chevrons and delta-shaped craft. So, I mean, that kind of description is pretty common. And so one thing that is interesting to me is whether or not the Phoenix Lights case represents one of these. There have been a lot of sightings over the years of these big black triangles. Think, for instance, back in the early 1990s, the Belgian wave, where we had many different members of law enforcement, military who allegedly saw these things. There were fighter jets scrambled to try and intercept these aircraft. And those have continued to be seen. Probably one of the most interesting cases, also worthy of mention here, because we've got very similar descriptions given by law enforcement officers, this distinct leading edge, silent movement. But we've got the St. Clair County incident from January of 2000, where we had several different law enforcement officers from different precincts who all in the early morning hours over St. Clair County, Illinois, they observed this big black triangular craft moving silently, often moving very slowly too. Earlier this year, because we had this NASA independent study team, and they took about $100,000 of U.S. taxpayer money to produce a report where they essentially just said, well, here are some things that could be done to study UFOs, and here's how NASA might be able to help. I would just be willing to say, I mean, if you gave us maybe $100,000, we might put some boots on the ground and do a little bit more investigation, maybe even review some of the better case studies, not just make recommendations. But all that aside, one of the things that the NASA team said was, we need more people with smartphones, and we need to leverage all the technology we now have, and we need to collect better data and more of it. I said, challenge accepted. I actually launched a website, the UAP Sightings Reporting System, and I've begun collecting historical sightings reports using a lot of the same criteria that NASA and also that the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office within the DoD are recommending that we should be collecting about these kinds of sightings. By the way, that's all freely available online. No paywalls, no FOIA requests needed. It's for the people and it's by the people, okay? But one of the number one kinds of reports I receive to this day, and the best reported with the most details, involve these big black triangles. I get them from former military witnesses. I get them from civilians, school teachers, pumping gas, look up and they see a big black triangular shaped object, sometimes hovering, sometimes they're moving slowly. I've even heard reports of these things moving and then suddenly turning vertically with the downward point facing downward, and they'll hover and objects come out of them. And as one former military observer, he was in civilian life when this happened, when he observed this, but as this object is hovering vertically, he says a little red light comes out of it, comes down. He described it as resembling like a barrel with a fire in it. Okay, a burn barrel as he called it. But he said this thing comes up, flies down, and he watches it for like a couple of hours as this little object performs what he likened to a grid search on the forest nearby as this thing hovers. Now, what kind of U.S. government craft can do that? Why would it do that? Hover out over a remote valley in Oregon, and these things move around and perform these strange maneuvers. So in the context of modern ufology, I mean, I get more of those reports and find them to be incredibly interesting. And I could say, I think Katie maybe could speak to this too, we get some pretty interesting reports that kind of sound like the Lubbock Lights too, and that's that kind of shape, and even what's depicted in the famous photograph Heather was talking about.
Yeah, it's more and more common that you're seeing these reports where you'll see a light, not necessarily a triangle, but sometimes, and you will have typically the three lights on the side. Sometimes they'll have that red light in the center. Sometimes we'll get the reports of these triangles being seen where you have reports of almost they're like transparent. You can see the stars either through them or they're blocking out the stars. I hear it both ways. So we're getting different descriptions of these triangles, but in some instances we have these lights that we're seeing there, and it's almost like they doppelgang or move over here instantaneously, and then you're seeing other lights drop out of them. We're getting more and more of those types of reports as well, which may be more connected to the Lubbock Lights in 1951, where we're seeing these lights move about as opposed to the Phoenix Lights, but still.
It's just interesting though, because a lot of people think of these as one-off classic cases. You had the Phoenix Lights, you had the Lubbock Lights. They're probably manifestations of these phenomena that continue throughout time, and in fact, a lot of people have observed very, very similar craft over the years.
And some of them are of immense size, right? I mean, a phrase that keeps popping up with reference to the Phoenix Lights is a mile wide. I mean, I've tried to visualize in my own mind what would be a mile wide. How would you even estimate that size? But that's so beyond imagination.
The only thing that I think in popular dialogue from science fiction, for instance, that comes to mind are like the Star Destroyers, you know, that the Imperial forces use in the Star Wars films, you know, those massive kind of, again, trianguloid-shaped objects. I've even seen some skeptics try to say that, well, of course, the big triangle reports don't start appearing until after that popular depiction appeared in Star Wars, so we can safely assume that people were influenced by that. Well, I'll dispute that right away. I've gotten some very interesting reports from people dating at least back to the 1960s where they describe the exact same massive black triangle craft capable of hovering, three lights at the points, red light in the center, and interestingly, even a police officer once shared a story with me and a photograph, very interesting, that seemed to show two independent orange orb-like objects or points of illumination that had descended from the craft and were moving around independently of that. That same thing was described in Belgium in the early 1990s. So It's worth mentioning that, again, there are some at least superficial similarities between the description, even the size, like you mentioned, Mark, of the Phoenix Lights, and these popular discussions of big black triangles in the UFO lore.
Right. And I think we'd be amiss not to mention David Marler's book, Triangles,
Yes.
The Estimate of the Situation. Excellent book, a really wonderful sighting that I think you referenced earlier about the police chase across the state lines.
Oh, yeah.
And that. So
David was the man on the ground in that one.
Right.
And yeah, it's a landmark case, but fortunately we, I think, had one of ufology's best researchers on the field and out there investigating. So yeah, Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation is the book. And again, it should be required reading on this subject.
it should be.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, I think even if you look at the world of ancient aliens, if you're going to glean anything from past documentation of strange things, it is lights in the sky, right? It is people seeing something in the sky that is anomalous, and it begins there, I think.
Just one final thing, and this is maybe just making a kind of a visual association. There are those famous renderings from, I believe, the 1500s, Nuremberg, Germany, that seems to show some very elaborate aerial display. I've seen, of course, the ancient astronaut theorist kind of explanation. I've seen the skeptics, theorization about what that might represent. Who knows, right? But it is interesting that there is this object resembling a spade. Now, the spade, of course, being whatever the artist interpreted or decided to represent, but I mean, superficially at least, it does look kind of like there's a big black object with a distinct trianguloid shape and a leading edge appearing in the sky. I don't know what that means or if that means anything, but one could make that sort of association.
Right. And like you said, it's all to the purpose of the artist. But I mean, I think whenever you get right down to it, something strange was in the sky, so they're trying to make sense of it. I think that's the way we look at it. But there's also that one famous triptych, and I'm not sure exactly what church, but it was during the Renaissance, whenever it shows the crucifixion of Christ, and on one panel it shows a triangular object chasing another triangular-shaped object as if that was actually going on. Now, it's been interpreted by art critics that represents the sun and the moon, right? Because at one time they believed that all heavenly bodies had a governing angel to it. And the person seems to be driving the craft, and the shape of the sun does appear to be of a male, and the other one was a female. So you do have that allusion to the sun and the moon, but it's the shape of the craft again. And again, we keep on coming back to the idea, triangular shaped craft, something happening in the sky that's under some sort of control.
Yeah, and I'll just throw this in here too. The in church art and architecture, a triangle is often suggestive of a triune God, because you've got one shape with three sides, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So
That's right.
more triangle fun.
And we also have a triangle on our money too, right? The all seeing eye and everything. Yes.
Yeah, very prevalent in esoteric literature,
Sure.
and of course has its obvious religious and spiritual associations as well. So the triangle, is again one of these. I just literally did that for all the conspiracy theorists out there. So anybody watching, they'll know we're part of the club. Yeah, but I mean that triangle, it is very much a. Don't mention the secret handshake. By the way. The triangle, it is definitely something that I think humans are drawn to, and it has certain symbolic meaning. Yeah.
The lights of Phoenix and Lubbock, while at first glance may seem to be anomalous, are, at least on the surface, incidents which may be recurring to untraceable points of origin in history. If nothing else, they are yet another striking example, at least in these two cases, of how witnessing and documenting a UFO experience can have irreparable consequences on the human witnesses.